Hello, I've got some new chapters for you. Chapters 19 and 20 from Fever 1793. Chapter 19 starts on September 26th, 1793. Shafts of death fly closer and closer to us every day. And that's from a letter that Dr. Benjamin Rush wrote in 1793. I dreamt of roast pork, sliced pink and dripping with juice. Remember how hungry she is. A roast beef bigger than a horse set on a giant platter that took up the entire front room, surrounded by steaming potatoes and parsnips and loaves of fresh bread. I had a bowl of butter all to myself and my very own pitcher of cold apple cider. The smell of mincemeat pie floated in from the kitchen. I lifted the first bite to my mouth when a noise snapped me awake. A footstep, a heavy footstep by the window. Silas scrambled off the blanket and ran across the floor. "What was that?" a strange voice asked. The room was silent. I held my breath. "Probably a rat," a second voice answered. "Hurry up. Get in there." Another footstep landed by the window. I turned toward the noise and saw a thin man in the moonlight. He was nearly as tall as the door, but I couldn't see his face. He glanced around the room. His eye did not catch me in the shadows. A second man entered through the window, shorter than the first. "There's no one here," the tall one said with more confidence in his voice. "You worry too much." I closed my eyes. I am still dreaming, I thought. These men are not here. I opened my eyes again. The tall one opened one of the cupboards built into the wall by the hearth. The short one peered outside. "I saw what I saw, and I saw smoke coming out of the chimney today," the short one said. "I don't know why I follow you. We should have gone to 4th Street. Nobody down there." He tapped the back of a chair nervously. "You worry too much. Look at this fireplace. There's been no light here for weeks. Come away from that window and help me. They don't serve whiskey here, but they have plenty of pewter, and silver hidden somewhere, no doubt." "Check the drawers over there," he said, as he pointed to the chest behind me. My stomach flipped. What should I do? If I screamed, Grandfather might wake and they could attack us both. The front door was locked and I didn't have the key. I could try to slip out the window and run for help, but who could I run to? Would anyone bother with a trifling robbery when there was death at every door? My disc is almost full. That is bad news. Okay, probably fine for now. The short man took a few steps in my direction, then stopped. He turned his back to me. "It's too dark over here. I need a candle." I slipped out of the blankets and into the corner. I needed to get them out of the house. If I could sneak out the window, I might try to scare them off. The tall one swore. "You don't need a candle. Shut up and do what you're told." I froze against the wall as the short one approached, grumbling under his breath. The window was just beyond my left hand, and the chest of drawers was on the other side of the window. The short one stood 3 feet away. I tried not to breathe. "Look at this," the short one said as he held up a chess figurine. Grandfather had won that chess set in a card game with the ship's captain from Siam. He taught me to play chess before I learned how to read. I simmered as the thief rubbed the queen with his dirty fingers. "It's not worth nothing hereabouts," he said, "but I bet would fetch a handsome sum in New York." He opened a sack tied to his belt and put the chess piece in. My hands balled into fists as he collected the rest of the chess pieces, king, bishop, knight, pawn, all smudged with his fingers, polluted by his breath. How dare he? My jaw tightened. Why were they here, standing in my front room, stealing the hard work of my family? I wanted to drop him into a sack and boot it out the door. The tall thief lifted Grandfather's sword from the mantel. "Go to New York if you wish, but I know a gentleman in Wilmington who will pay a pretty price for this." "That's not worth the Continental," the short one laughed. "I could get a better price for my old stockings. Every old man in America drags his rusty sword around and claims he ran it through 100 British. It's a piece of junk." I glared at him from my hiding place. "Grandfather did kill British soldiers with that sword. He told me so himself." "Steady on, Mattie. Crawl out the window as soon as he looks away." The tall one pulled the sword from the scabbard and slashed it through the air. "Maybe I won't sell it then. It could be a handy weapon." He tested the blade with his thumb. "Still sharp, and I don't see a bit of rust. I could become a highwayman." He advanced across the floor toward his partner, waving the sword. "What ho there, my good man! I have come to relieve you of your purse." "Give over. Let's fill our bags and leave. You can play at the tavern." The tall one would not relent. He pressed ahead, continuing to brandish the sword back and forth wildly. The tip of the blade swept by my face. He shuffled forward another foot and waved his arm again, the sword level with my neck. "No!" I screamed as I ducked. As soon as the sword passed over me, I ran for the kitchen, colliding with the tall man and knocking him down. "It's a ghost!" the short man cried. "It's a girl, you fool!" the tall one growled as he jumped to his feet. Get her! I ran through the kitchen to the back door and fumbled with the bolt. The thieves' footsteps thudded on the oak floor. Open, open, open! The bolt slid back. I pushed down the latch and opened the door. I crossed the porch in 2 steps and ran across the warm hearth toward the gate. My foot came down hard on a sharp rock. I cried out but kept running. The gate was only a few more steps. Faster, faster! 2 bony hands curled around my shoulders like the claws of a panther and yanked me backward. I hit the ground so hard it knocked the breath out of me. The tall man picked me up and carried me back into the house, where the short man was finishing his search through the chest of drawers. You should have let her go, the short one said. What good is she to us? This haint here will tell us where they've hidden all their silver. I'm sure they have a strong box as well, the tall man said as he tied my wrists together in front of me. I spat at him. Smack! The tall man slapped me across the face, jerking my head backward. Don't hit her, the short man protested. I'll do what I please, the tall man said, as he wiped his face on his sleeve. Now, missy, the silver in the strong box, where are they? We've already been robbed. They took everything. You're too late, I said. See, we're too late. Let's go. The short man pulled on his partner's sleeve. Shove off, the tall man shouted. What if she's lying? You think she's going to hand over all her money because we ask her nicely? She needs to be convinced. He drew back his arm to hit me again. Thump. What was that noise? The tall man demanded. Hang on a second. I got to plug us in. Okay. There we go. I just heard a noise upstairs. He looked at the ceiling. I shouldn't have screamed. Grandfather must have heard me and gotten out of bed. I needed to get those men out of the house. Who's up there? I thought you were alone, said the tall man. It's just my cat. I tried to keep the fear from my voice. Everyone else has died of yellow fever, I lied. Saints preserve us more fever victims, groaned the short man. Let's go now. This wench is probably fever poisoned, too. She don't look too good. The tall man hesitated. She's hiding something, he said. He drew back suddenly and hit me in the face again. My head rang and lights danced before my eyes. Where's the money? The man demanded. Tell me where the money is. Get away from my granddaughter. Grandfather stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, his rifle aimed at the heart of the man who had hit me. Oh, Lord, said the short man. He put one leg out the window. I'm going to 4th Street. The houses are empty and the cupboards are full. He's not going to shoot, said my attacker. Look at him. He can barely stand. His knees are knocking together. One puff and he'll blow over. Isn't that right, old man? Now tell me where you've hidden the money or I'll have to hurt this little girl here. I'll count to 3, said Grandfather. He wasn't fooling around. Grandfather never fooled around when he counted to 3. The few times he had whipped me had been when he had counted to 3 and I didn't listen. 1. The short robber scrambled out the window without another word. 2. Grandfather swayed to one side. He was breathing heavily, too heavily. No, Grandfather, I pleaded, put the gun down. He licked his lips and stared down the barrel. 3. Everything happened at once. The gun fired just as the tall man leaped to the side. The blast knocked Grandfather against the door frame. The tall man jumped on Grandfather and punched him in the face. I kicked at the tall man until he hit me with the back of his hand and sent me sprawling. I struggled to my feet. Grandfather's sword still lay on the floor where the robber had dropped it. I picked up the sword, holding it with 2 hands. Grandfather had taught me a bit about swordplay, along with his other army lessons. Let go of him, I shouted. The man ignored me. His hands were around Grandfather's throat. Grandfather weakly hit back at the man, but it had no effect. The man struck Grandfather's head against the floor. Grandfather's eyelids fluttered and then closed. No! I screamed. I swung the sword and gashed the thief's shoulder. He howled and rolled to the side, gasping at the bloody wound. You cut me, he said in disbelief. The wench cut me with the sword. Get out of my house before I cut out your heart. I raised the sword and ran at him. He lurched to the window and crawled through it. I followed, screaming the kinds of words that would have raised every hair on my mother's head. I chased the man for a block before I realized that Grandfather was out of danger, but he needed me back home, not standing in the street, in the dead of night, brandishing a bloody sword like a pirate. He was sitting up when I returned. Don't move, I'll help you. I dropped the sword to the floor and struggled free of the bonds that held my hands together. He looked at me with a slow smile. Always knew you had it in you, he said, hoarsely. You're a fighter, no doubt about that. Hush, don't say a word, I cautioned. I grabbed my bedding and made a pillow for his head. I'll get you some water. No, he insisted. He grabbed my shift. Stay. The moonlight quivered as thin clouds scuttled across the sky. I could smell the stench of the intruders and the soap Grandfather had used to wash his face before he went to sleep. His eyes started to close, but he forced them open. He fumbled for my hand. I'm sorry, Maddie, he panted. I'm leaving you alone. I shook my head mutely. No, this would not happen. No, please God, anything but this. He nodded once. My time. Too early. So sorry. I covered my mouth to hold in the scream and rocked back and forth. After all he had been through, to die like this? Don't die. I couldn't hold the words back. Don't die, grandfather. Please don't die. I love you. Please, please. Oh, dear God, please don't die. My face was wet, my tears splashing onto his cheeks. Strong, he whispered. Beautiful, clever. My sweet Maddie. His eyes closed. Aw. I bent down to kiss his forehead. I thought I heard his last words. Love you. Dead? Grandfather couldn't be dead. My grandfather. Candy-giving, wood-chopping, tobacco-smelling grandfather. Who carried me through Philadelphia like a princess? Who knew every politician, printer, carpenter, and captain? Who fed stray dogs? Who curbed mother's tongue? Who carved me a doll's cradle? Who dried my tears? Dead. I held my breath and waited for the earth to stop spinning. The sun need not rise again. There was no reason for the rivers to flow. Birds would never sing. The sound came straight from my heart, as sharp as the point of a sword. I shrieked to the heavens and pounded the floor with rage. No, 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 don't take him. I picked up the sword and attacked a chair as if it were death itself. When the chair was a pile of firewood and the sword dull, I fell to my knees by the side of my grandfather's body, dead, growing cold. I straightened his arms and legs so he might lay with dignity. What should I do next? There was no one to ask. I felt like a baby girl just learning to walk. Only the ground on my feet was shaking and I had no one to hold on to. Silas patted in and rubbed himself along grandfather's hand. He lay down beside me. I took a shaky breath and looked at the face that had loved me so much. The light was gone from his eyes, blown out. I gently closed his eyelids with my fingertips. I was not afraid to touch him. There were other things to do. Think now. I tried to remember the funerals I'd seen. I dimly remembered seeing an elderly woman's body during a wake when I was younger. There was a bandage around her jaw to keep her mouth closed. I pulled myself from the floor and marched to the clothes press. I took out a few of our finest napkins and a linen tablecloth. A small package thumped to the floor, but I didn't bother to examine it. I used the napkins to bind up grandfather's jaw. I hesitated before moving him onto the tablecloth. Would he want to be buried in his nightshirt? A smile skirted across my face before I could stop it. I thought I heard him chuckle, but his body was as still as ever. He once told me that death is the eternal sleep. What could be more fitting than his nightshirt? Might be more comfortable than forcing him to wear tight clothing for eternity. He'd understand. I covered him with the tablecloth, but it sent an icy chill through me. I was supposed to cover his face. That's what people would expect, but I couldn't force myself to do it. He had such a kind face. I folded the tablecloth down below his chin. It looked like he was asleep. An owl hooted outside. I wondered where King George was, if he knew that grandfather was gone. Maybe that's why King George had left us, to prepare a place for this old soldier. I sniffed and wiped a tear from my face. Silly to cry about a dead parrot, I told myself. The first tear gave way to another, and then another. I passed the night kneeling by the side of the finest man I had ever known, praying that the morning would not come. Chapter 20. September 27th, 1793. Doctors raving and disputing, death's pale army still recruiting, said by Philip Freneau in a book called Pestilence, written during the prevalence of a yellow fever, 1793. Bring out your dead. What was that? Bring out your dead, the hoarse voice echoed off the cobblestones and brick houses. I opened the shutters a crack and peered out. A man dressed in rags pushed a large cart that already contained two corpses, a child and a young woman, their skin tinted a pale yellow. The cart was not heavy, but the man walked slowly, as if he were pushing the weight of the world. My hands shook against the window frame. A cold wind from my nightmare blew through my mind. I had to remember something. Bring out your dead! Grandfather. I whirled. His body still lay on the floor. My stomach clenched. I ran outside and threw up what little was in my stomach on the side of the road. It wasn't a nightmare. It truly happened. All of it. The sour taste burned my mouth, and my hands would not stop shaking. There could be no running from this. Hiding from death was not like hiding from Mother when she wanted me to scrub kettles, or ignoring Silas when he begged for food. I was the only one left. I had to bury my grandfather, and soon. Hot weather was most unkind to the dead. That was made painfully clear up at Bush Hill. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop the flow of tears. Crying wouldn't help anything. My duty was clear. I understood why the cartman walked so slowly. Death was a heavy companion. I wiped my mouth on the hem of my dress. The cart turned down 7th Street and headed south. I ran to catch up with it. A few minutes later, grandfather's body was loaded into the death cart. When the man realized I would follow him to the park, he treated grandfather's body with respect. He gave me time to dash upstairs and find grandmother's portrait. Grandfather had looked upon her face every night before he fell asleep. I tucked it underneath his arm as he lay in the cart. It pained me that he could not be buried next to her in the churchyard. I hoped that taking her image to the grave with him would be a comfort. I nodded to the man. He struggled to push the cart. Grandfather's weight made it harder to manage. I tapped him on the shoulder. He looked me up and down once and then moved to the side. I grasped one of the cart handles with both hands. We both heaved, and the wheels rolled. Together we pushed the cart to the burial ground. The funeral procession for Captain William Farnsworth Cook, should have been loud and long, crowded with friends, exchanging memories of the grand old man, but the streets were ghosted, colorless and hushed. His casket should have been pulled by a fine white horse, not pushed by a girl and a stranger. I shifted my hands on the heavy handle. A sliver bit into my palm, and I couldn't stop the tears. He was gone, truly gone. The burial square was quiet, yet busy with activity. 30, maybe 40 men were methodically digging the earth and laying the dead to rest. 2 of them picked up my grandfather's body and laid it on a large canvas cloth that reminded me of a sail. They wrapped the cloth around him and quickly sewed the shroud shut with thick curved needles. I stood behind them, silent and numb. They lifted grandfather's shroud by the top and the bottom and prepared to fling it into the open grave. My voice erupted. "Stop!" All heads turned to look at me. I didn't realize what I had done at first. The men set the shroud on the ground. "You can't just toss him in there like a sack of potatoes," I said. "Where's the minister? You're not supposed to bury people without prayers." The men looked at each other. The one who stood at grandfather's feet spoke softly. "The minister will come by later today and pray for all the dead, miss. There are so many people alive who'd need tending to. The dead have to wait their turn. I'm sure God will understand. Now please, miss, let us get on with this work." He bent over to pick up the shroud. "Put him down," I said. The men ignored me. A spiteful voice hissed in my head. "Shut up, Maddie," the voice said. "You're a silly child. You have no business ordering these men around. Stop interfering and get out. This is no place for you. Get your sniveling self to the orphan house, where they'll feed you and dry your tears." My head throbbed to the rhythm of the shovels biting into the earth. My hands decided what to do without consulting the rest of my body. I shoved the man who spoke to me, shoved him so hard he nearly toppled into the grave. He scrambled to his feet, protesting. I ran up to him and clenched the front of his shirt in my blistered hands. This was a great man, Captain William Farnsworth Cook of the Pennsylvanian 5th Regiment. He was my grandfather. You will not bury him without a prayer. I spoke slowly with iron force behind every word. "The lass is right," said the man who had pushed the cart. It was the first time he had spoken. He took a slim book from his pocket and offered it to me. "Can you read?" I nodded and took the book from him. It was a copy of the Psalms, the pages worn thin and dirty from frequent use. I stared at the gravediggers. They took off their caps and bowed their heads. Movement in the park stopped as those watching laid down their shovels and bowed their heads. The book opened to the familiar words. I swallowed, cleared my throat, and began to read loudly, so that all could hear. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The men around me moved their lips and then gave voice. Our voices rose together as one, proclaiming faith, joining in grief. At the end of the reading, some crossed themselves, others wiped their eyes. I stood straight and tall. "Thank you." I handed the book back and walked away. There was nothing more for me to do. My feet moved, taking me up one street and down the next. I didn't see another person for blocks, not even a gravedigger or a physician. The sound of my shoes tapping across the cobblestones echoed down the street like a latecomer sneaking into church. I walked past the homes of people acquainted with my family. They were all deserted. My shift darkened with sweat. Surely I wasn't the only person left in Philadelphia. My mind whirled. What to do? What to do? I should find a way to the Luddingtons. No, that would be impossible. I should go to the orphan house. They would take me in. The compass spun wildly. No, I could care for myself. I was not a child. Bush Hill? Mrs. Flagg would see that I was fed, and I could help care for the sick, but the memories of that place were filled with the sound of grandfather's voice and the rumble of his laugh. Don't borrow trouble. That's what Eliza would say. Don't borrow trouble. I'd go to the market for some food. Then I'd hole up at home and wait for the frost. No one had a duty to me, and I had no claim on anyone else. But it mattered not. I would see my way through. My stomach took control. The first thing was to find a meal. I felt faint and queasy. I stood in the shade of a linden tree and then set out the short distance to the market. My steps slowed as I approached the market. No noise greeted me. I checked my bearings twice to make sure I had not taken a wrong turn. It was empty. A hot wind blew trash and dirt through the abandoned stalls. It looked like an enormous broom had swept away all the people. I thought of what Mrs. Bowles had said. Was the fever really keeping the farmers away? But how could city people eat if a market closed? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark mass near an overturned basket. It could be potatoes or carrots. I picked up my skirts and hurried over to investigate. Rats. Shiny, slippery rats, fat and fast, poured in and out of the basket, twitching their noses and flicking their tails. I had never seen rats so far away from the river. Where were the dogs, the cats that kept them away? And what would I do now? How was I going to eat? A chest of gold wouldn't buy any food here today. A coughing fit overtook me, and I felt faint. I stumbled into Mrs. Epler's stall and sat in the stray white feathers that littered the ground. Now what? Take inventory, check the pack and powder. I was alone. Grandfather was dead and Mother missing. I had survived the fever but still felt weak. There was little food in the garden and no food to buy. Thieves and scoundrels prowled the streets. My pack was empty and my powder wet. I had no choice but to walk home, where I could at least lock the doors. When I came upon the open windows of the Federal Gazette office, it was a shock. A horse was tethered by the door. I stumbled through the door, eager for a friendly face. Can I help you? It's me, Mr. Brown, William Cook's granddaughter. The printer looked up from his desk. The dark circles under his eyes and lines of worry across his brow made him look as if he had aged years in the course of a month. What do you need, Matilda? I have no time for social calls today. I hesitated. What could Mr. Brown do? I couldn't work a press. He couldn't bring grandfather back from the grave. Please, sir, I said, I would like to place an advertisement in your newspaper. I'm searching for my mother. She's gone. Mr. Brown pulled a stained kerchief out of his trouser pocket and rubbed it over his face and neck. Matilda, there is nothing I'd rather do than run an advertisement for your mother. But look about you. He spread his arms to take in the shop. There is hardly any paper to be had for 100 miles. The Gazette is the last paper being printed in the city, and I have to print it on half sheets. 5 other newspapers have closed down. I wish I could flee myself. He paused and looked out the window. I thought he had forgotten me. But I must stay. This paper is the only method of communication left in the city. I must print the physician's notices, orders from the mayor. His face dropped to his hands. The shop was perfectly quiet, save for the sound of the clock ticking on the wall and a fly caught in the spider's web strung across a grimy window pane. Mr. Brown, sir? He took a deep breath and looked up. In the beginning of August, this was the largest city in the United States. 40,000 people lived here. Near as I can tell, he pointed to the jumble of notes and letters on the desk before him, more than half the city has fled. 20,000 people. How many dead, sir? More than 3,000, enough to fill house after house, street after street. I went to the market but found no food, I said. Few farmers dare come into town. They charge exorbitant prices for their wares and get whatever they ask. He said bitterly, those who don't die of the fever are beginning to starve. You've seen the rats? I nodded. The rats thrive. I should write that. He dipped a quill into the ink pot and scribbled a note. The only creatures to benefit from this pestilence are the rats. Go home, Matilda. Take my regards to your grandfather, but tell him he must lock all the doors and pray for frost. I started to tell him what had happened, but a man burst through the door, waving a letter and shouting. Mr. Brown shooed me from his shop with a wave of his hand. No matter, telling him wouldn't bring grandfather back, and it was clear he couldn't help me. I turned the corner and found myself in front of Mr. Warner's hat shop, Mrs. Warner's hat shop. She knew my mother a bit. Perhaps they would let me stay a day or two, or share some bread. But the hattery was locked up tight. I couldn't even peek inside through the shutters. No sign of the Warner family. Hey there, you, girlie, by the Hatters. A sharp-eyed woman holding a cloth over her face crossed the street. She was older than Mother, with white wisps of hair escaping a dirty mob cap. Her dress was faded, her eyes narrowed, watching me with suspicion. She stopped a few paces away from me, her cane slightly raised. What business do you have here? Off with you, the woman shouted. I mean no harm, I explained. My nose wrinkled at the smell of vinegar coming from the woman. Do you know where the Warners are? The woman stepped backward. What is your business here? She demanded. I'm looking for a friend. The woman considered me for a moment. They left for Chester in the dark of night. Warner has kin there. There was a horrible screaming and carrying on. The youngest girl fell ill after an apprentice died. She spat the word like a wormy seed. They threw out the body on the way. And you, do you carry this evil blot on your soul as well? I fell ill, but recovered in the Bush Hill Hospital. Get back! Stay away from me! The woman shrieked as she raised her cane higher. "Leave before I call my man. No fever victims here." She brought the cane down across my back. The blow sent me face first into the dirt. "Leave!" the woman screamed. I fought my way to my feet again before the cane crashed downward again. I ran blindly, ignoring the pain in my throat and the ache in my side. The sun blazed overhead. I lost my way. The cut on my foot started to bleed again. I walked and walked, trying not to remember or feel. I wandered up one street and down the next. The printer's words haunted me. Thousands dead. I saw grandfather's empty eyes. No food. I saw mother order me to leave her. No hope. I passed people weeping in doorways and did not stop. I heard the death carts rattling in the street and did not look up. A breeze picked up, pushing me eastward, toward the docks, east toward the water, away from the sun. I could see the tops of ships' masts peeking over the rooftops like trees in the dead of winter. The sodden wharf planks moaned as the tide pulled the river water toward the open sea. My mind floated with dark thoughts. What did it feel like to die? Was it a peaceful sleep? Some thought it was full of either trumpet-blowing angels or angry devils. Perhaps I was already dead. I shook my head. Nonsense, foolish nonsense. I was being weak and foolish. There was no point in wandering like a lost puppy. I needed to get home and sleep. Grandfather would not be proud if he saw me acting so spineless. I needed to captain myself. My foot scuffed something. I looked down to keep from tripping. A china-faced doll wearing a satin dress lay by the curb, her head shattered, her dress coated with dirt. A few steps away, an abandoned satchel, still packed with clean shirts, lay open. I picked up the broken doll and heard a whimpering sound coming from an open doorway. I put my head through the door and waited for my eyes to adjust to the gloom. A small child cowered in the corner, her blonde hair loose and tangled, her feet bare and black with dirt. She was sucking her thumb and keening to herself. I held out the doll to her. "Is this yours?" I asked. "Broken," she said. "Is your mama here or your papa? Perhaps they can fix it." The little girl whispered something. I stepped closer to hear her. "Mama's broken too," she said. And that's the end of that sad chapter. 2 more tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.